Welcome to Grinding the Data. My name is Kevin Scott. It's great to be back for another episode here in our expert series. We've been talking with some top players and analysts in the fantasy football world. I know I've been learning a ton from each of them. Today we have the honor of welcoming in the great Dwain McFarland. Welcome, man.
Hey, man. Thank you. I don't know if I'd use the word great, but I'm happy to come on and talk football. And I know something that you've really, you and I have talked for quite a long time. You play in a lot of the same type of leagues as me, the FFPC. So I'm kind of surprised we haven't done this before. Like, I know we probably had a scheduling conflict or something in the past, but I feel like I already have been on the show before, but I haven't.
Yeah, no, thank you for taking the time, man. I appreciate it. Dwain and I have not been able to chat in person, but this is cool too. Next best thing. I do look forward to meeting one day in the flesh. If you aren't familiar with Dwain, he's been an excellent player in the high stakes role for quite a while. He's written for several sites over the years. He's well known for his analytical data he shared on Twitter for many years. That's where we first got acquainted. Eventually, he was snapped up by Establish the Run and recently by PFF, now full time there. I know I find the data you share very valuable. I know I personally find it, the most helpful, I think, because I know you're more than an analyst. I know you're a great player too. It gives it a little more weight for me. So it's definitely an honor to have you on.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Like that's my favorite as well. I'm drawn to players that are really good at fantasy football, like that have an analytical bend, as well. But
Yeah.
I mean, I do realize that there's different ways to win, right? So I'm
Right.
always trying to learn from other really good players. And I'm excited. Like, I feel like this fantasy football overall is more and more becoming a community where a lot of you're starting to see your experts win a lot of the big prizes, or players that are
Right.
really good and they're winning big prizes, or they're consistent. They're starting to get more into writing and sharing their thoughts.
Exactly.
Before it was more, we had a lot of that on the DFS side, not quite as much in the season long. And there's a whole new guard, man. I'm so excited for like what's going on in fantasy football right now. Like, so many really sharp young minds as well that are out there. So it's a really good time, to be in this industry. And it's also just growing, it just continues to grow. There's just more opportunity. You and I were talking before the show came on, like, it's always been a dream, like, to get to do something like this, but like to financially have an offer that made enough sense that you could actually stop doing the job you were doing, to come do something like this. Just wasn't always possible, like, 10 years ago. But there's been a lot of other great, people like Evan Silva, Adam Levitan, Matt Waldman, a lot of other folks like have really blazed, a pathway and made the game more popular. And it's also helped, increase the pay, for analysts.
Right. Yeah. It's such a blessing that you could, quit what you were doing and start this. And, it's also, like you were saying, the way that's expanding because you're doing this work full time. We're getting more information from you and from so many others who are doing it full time too. So it's just going to make the whole community more educated and better at what we're doing. So it's pretty cool.
Honestly, that's one of my biggest struggles, is like narrowing down, okay, what am I going to focus on? Because there's so much I want to dig into.
Right.
And it's not super easy because there's things I have a hypothesis about something, that I think is probably really going to be valuable. And then I may test it and it's not, so I'll still write something about it, but, it may end up being more descriptive. So it's like, sometimes you just don't know for sure how valuable something's going to be until you dig into it. And I've got a list, like just this huge list. And so trying to, like, I have it prioritized, but there's just so much stuff I want to get to now that, because with PFF, there's just access to so much more data than what I've really ever had.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Very cool, man. Well, we're happy to have you on. We're going to go through and I'm going to ask you some questions, what I've been doing with all these experts. So just kind of asking you questions about how you see, this past season, how it turned out, and then, what you think going forward in the 2022 season, especially, and just in general, changes that might have occurred. And then at the end, you guys stick around if you're listening with us live, because we're going to dive into 10 of our player targets when we look at current ADP. So let's jump into some questions here. Looking back at the 2021 fantasy season, or just the NFL season in general, what would you say surprised you? What sticks out as a surprising development?
I think there's a couple things, like on the NFL front, like itself, just how defenses are evolving to try to really, living in Kansas City, you're a huge Mahomes fan, how defenses are really evolving to try to shut down big passing game, or not shut it down, but at least limit it. Right.
Right.
And And we're seeing players like Mahomes have to adjust, and he did a good job down the stretch. Mahomes did adjust. He was still one of the top fantasy quarterbacks to have down the stretch in the fantasy playoffs. But even Mahomes, if you compare him to what you were used to getting from Mahomes, like even when he adapted, like you're not getting the fantasy points that you were getting through the air. So I think you're only going to see more and more and more defenses evolve to adopt more and more of that strategy. And it's going to be interesting. So where is that equilibrium where it starts? What is the offense going to do to swing things back in their favor? Right. So we've probably got something coming up in the next year or two. It's going to be something that's going to be a change on the offensive side of the ball. Will it potentially be a little bit more running? Will it be getting, more passing underneath, involved? Because college has already done this. College, the biggest change like receivers see moving from college to NFL is they don't get the behind the line of scrimmage stuff. Their target share for wide receivers specifically goes 5% less of their targets come at or behind the line of scrimmage. When they get to the NFL, they trade those for targets in the 1 to 9 yard range. And that's just the historical NFL, right? Hey, run your route, get open, get a first down. So NFL teams, there's a lot of room for them to start baking in even more and more of the things that you see in college, or do things like what the 49ers do, which is really taking advantage of all the zone coverages being run and really working, their players into space, not just behind the line of scrimmage. They did it a ton with Debo, but a lot with your breaking routes off of play action. Those are things that have been around for a long time, but we're just seeing teams use more and more and more play action. So I would say that's a tactical side of football, strategy. Tactics of football are changing, on the field. That's impacting the product we see as far as fantasy football goes. But I think just from a game perspective, man, I think it's similar because I'm a big poker player. I don't get to play as much, here lately, but I think it's similar to the time I remember whenever poker really went through a big boom, and I was one of the younger players coming up through that boom. And I remember really challenging the way players that have played poker for a long time thought about it and, making them have to evolve to change their game. I now feel like I am the fantasy player that's having to evolve to way the new young fantasy players. Right. And the best way I can describe it is aggressiveness, but just like poker, it's very strategic and it's smart. It's not just haphazard aggressiveness. These players are very sharp. They understand how to create edges through game theory, right? And they're just, I don't want to call it galaxy braining because it's like there's value in it. Typically when I think of galaxy brain, it's like, oh, you totally overthought it, right?
Right. Yeah.
So there's some of that still going on. But just the game theory, how aggressive folks are willing to be. I saw it show up in several different spots, through the season, whether it was in the draft, whether it was in the way free agents were handled and redraft leagues, the way that the different types of fantasy football truly are growing to be more different. Dynasty versus best ball versus season long. Used to, right? There were just kind of, more just things that people would throw out there, right? Oh, well, in Dynasty, you want in Dynasty, you want this type of player.
Right.
Or over in best ball, you want this type of player. That stuff's all much more refined now. And people are talking a lot about it. People are brainstorming together. Another reason it's just fun, to be part, of this community right now. Actually, some days, I'm grinding the data and I'm so down in the weeds of that. I come up for air and it's I'm on Twitter and I see all these great conversations going on. I'm like, man, I need to engage and do more of that. But it's I'm on this task that I'm on and I can be very type A about stuff like that. It's no, I have to stay focused on this, have to get done. But I think those are two things: the way that fantasy is being played, number one, and then number two, just the way the game itself on the field, there's some evolution going on.
Yeah, very interesting. If you had to pinpoint, let's just strip it down just to redraft. I know we both play in a bunch of these Football Guys type drafts. What
it's still my favorite, but it's mine. It's what I've always played.
Yeah, it's a blast. But if you think just those leagues, for example, or main event or whatever, what's one with what you're saying, guys getting more aggressive? This young crop of players. What would you say is an example of that in those type of leagues?
Yeah, so in the draft season last year, and I think some of this is because of these other types of fantasy games that we have, like best ball,
right?
But you saw last July probably was when it hit all of a sudden, especially over on Underdog, you just saw all the ADPs of these younger receivers just shooting up, right? And it's because of there's really good podcasts you can listen to. People are coming together. They're thinking about it. They're open to new ways of doing things. And so a huge value to me, like forever since I've been playing redraft, is I've always been really good at grabbing rookies and other young receivers, like in round 7, 8, 9, 10. Even a couple of years ago, I remember pushing for CeeDee Lamb in round 7 over Michael Gallup, and people were like, "What?" And I thought I was being aggressive. Well, then last year you get Jamar Chase going in the 4th round,
right?
Until he all of a sudden, the rumor was he couldn't catch the football because they didn't have a stripe on it. Crap like that. Those are things that are old as time that you can always use. Not to get off too much on a tangent, but if you're drafting multiple teams, use the news cycles to your advantage. Like when a player gets overhyped, let off. Like when their ADP shoots up. Somebody else is moving down your board when they're moving up your board. You got to figure out who those players are and why, and if you think there's still value there. So last year, like Jamar Chase, as soon as that story hit, like I was drafting him on every team I could. Because then I was getting him at the end of the 5th, the beginning of the 6th. I got him in the middle of the 6th, into the 6th a couple of times. So I ended up with a lot of Jamar Chase, but not in my July or early August drafts when he was still, he was going in the 4th round in those drafts. He still would have ended up being worth it. But like, I'm also, everything is a calculated risk, right? At that point, there were other trade-offs at the time that I felt better about, in the 4th round, but you also know that these ebbs and flows, occur. So, but that's a good example. Like all the receivers push up, and typically I try to fill my flexes with receivers.
Right.
I have, for a long time. And some of that goes back to Sean Siegel, RotoViz stuff, things like that, or, around, just the volatility that you have to deal with running backs and injuries and things like that. But I'm not like this, oh my God, you got to be a 0 draft running back. I'm more behind the theory of how you build, these rosters, right? And the way you think about 0, I definitely agree with some of the tenets that are in that. So I think there's a lot of other young players that are now onto that, and they're buying into that. And they're becoming, their market share, their piece of the draft, the number of drafts they're in with you, like it's growing. Used to, I pretty much would just draft with the old guard, and I knew kind of how they were going to draft. And so I have to stay a lot sharper now in my drafts than what I used to, I think. And a lot of those players are also extremely good as well, So, I mean, I'm in the over 40 club now. So
me too.
I gotta stay on my toes with this stuff. And there's really good players like Chad Schroeder's I think is the best, season-long fantasy player in the world, period. He still uses a lot of the same strategies that he's always used, and he's really successful at those. So it's not just you got to deal with the whole crowd, but when there's diversity of thought, to me, you've got to be more adaptable in your draft, because you just don't know. It's like at poker. You don't know how good of a table are you going to sit down at.
Exactly.
Are you going to sit down with a bunch of other sharks? Well, there can be multiple types of sharks. There could be a loose aggressive player, a tight aggressive player. There's all, you got to be able to adapt to the different styles. And you're seeing more and more of that, I think, in fantasy football. So it's just, it makes the game more fun, but it also makes it, you got to really be on your game, like to keep your margins up.
Yeah, like we were talking about earlier, the level of education is rising, and so there's so many people in every draft you go in who, for example, read Sean Siegel, or thinking they at least are aware of that type of thinking, even if they don't draft 0 RB. So, yeah, it's definitely
I think just coming into something and having a moldable mind about something, right? Because a lot of these folks have only been playing fantasy 2 or 3 years, and so I think they're much more likely to be open to, it's just nature, right? The longer you're around, the more easy it is to become kind of set in certain ways that you do things. So I think especially, now you have to challenge yourself to not, allow that to happen, which I love, because I love always trying to figure out, is there a better way to do something? So it's been awesome having this infusion of youth.
Yeah, very cool. As it relates to players specifically, do you have any where you think back and you're like, man, I was right about that guy, I totally nailed it, or I was totally wrong, I missed that guy?
I have some of each.
Yeah.
But so Waddle was my most drafted player. So in the formats you and I play in, we're usually playing 2 flex players, drafting him in the 9th or 10th round, of every single draft. So I'm fine being way over exposure on players that you can get in those rounds, so Waddle was my guy this year. My next most drafted player was Mark Andrews. He ended up being on 40% of my squads, and I play him mostly like you, tight end premium type stuff. So between Andrews and Waddle, those were huge hits for me.
Yeah.
Because those are players that, especially Waddle, getting him as late as I was, he immediately was one of my flex spots on every single team. And it was a big help too, because I mostly went anchor running back. I know we'll talk strategies here in a minute. They do change every year. But having gone anchor running back, it was very important, that I be hitting on the players that were going to be in my flex. So Waddle, on over half of my teams, immediately took care of one of my flex spots, which was it's huge when you can hit on a player like that. Every few years I'll have somebody that I'm just totally, you won't find me being all in on players in the third and fourth round. I try to be more diverse. Usually, I'm looking for archetypes of players.
Right.
And in those rounds, I basically want to diversify. That's the way I set my tiers up. I'm like, okay, these guys are in this age group. They fit this archetype that I'm looking for when I'm drafting in this range. And so I'll mix all those players up. But as I get later and later, I have more of my guys that I'm making sure I'm getting them. And so Waddle was huge. You had to take Mark Andrews earlier. He was typically a fourth round pick last year in FFPC. But I just loved the fact that I knew he had the ceiling. We had seen it before. The efficiency had been huge. And just knowing that any path that ended up opening up more targets, which was either, hey, finally they let him run more routes, and there were reasons to think that could occur because they've moved on from some of the other tight ends. That's always been his issue. He's only on the field for like 60% of the times the team drops back to pass, and they're a run-heavy team. Well, the only path was through efficiency. But knowing that efficiency was there and knowing that, okay, maybe he could get to 70 or 80%, which he did. He got over 80%, which is the mark you want your tight ends at for routes run per drop back. That typically equals, if you're doing that, you're usually going to have a top 5 season just by hitting that one threshold alone, even if you're not that good of a tight end. But knowing if he could get to that and have the elite talent that he had, I just knew that, like, the ceiling, didn't expect him to outscore Kelsey, but you knew he had a path to doing that.
Yep.
So those were the big hits.
Any big misses?
Yeah, the misses. So man, Trey Sermon was my biggest.
Oh
miss.
Yeah, me too.
He was on half of my teams. I wasn't drafting, running backs pretty much from the 4th round through the 7th or 8th round, not just because we call it dead zone and not just because it's this, oh my God, every year you got to avoid these rounds for running backs. It's more the profiles of the backs that were going in those ranges. But he was one of the ones where I wasn't afraid of the profile. I really wanted the younger player. I wanted the exposure to the Shanahan offense. It just turns out that it was Elijah Mitchell, and you could have gotten him at the end of your draft.
It was a good strategy. You just didn't get there. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank God, Jalen Waddle basically erased that mistake for me on all my teams. So that was the biggest miss. Another player that I missed by not drafting enough was really Leonard Fournette. And so that's kind of a lesson learned. Like, Leonard Fournette was still in a decent age bracket. Yes, there was a potential committee on a pass heavy team, Gio Bernard showing up there. You still had Rojo in the mix. You had Lenny. And even though I knew that the year before, like, Fournette, from a utilization standpoint, had really, he had shown that he could be an every down back. I should have known, though, like, with his age, the fact he had shown that he could be an every down back, the Tampa Bay offense, knowing that I had it graded as a top 5 offense, and he's a former high 1st round pick. Like, those guys just get more chances in the NFL. So I should have bought more into that variance. I mean, you could have got Lenny in the 8th or 9th round a lot of times.
Yeah, at least get him on 20% or something. Yeah.
I didn't have him on. I had 0. I had
Me too.
zero
Lenny.
So,
I just didn't believe. And I thought it was going to be Rojo getting more early down. And and that's one of those things
did
too.
His normal thing. He fumbled. That's the thing. You got to remember, these things
coaches,
we can't control can always come in. So if you can find a profile of a player that fits like Lenny on an offense like that, I'll just be more. And what's funny is I was open to Sony Michel in the same range.
Right. I remember you saying, Sony.
And I mean, but Lenny's the one that worked out. And my logic was the same for Michel, an offense I liked, still was a former 1st round pick. They had made a trade for him. Obviously, Akers going down is what moved Michel up, into basically round 7 through 9 range in most drafts, like FFPC redraft stuff. So I had plenty of Michel, but I didn't have Fournette. I had plenty of James Conner, but I didn't have Leonard Fournette.
Yeah, and he was the presumed starter. I just kept thinking of Arians too, like, oh, he's going to spread it around, but I should have thought of Arians. So if you make a mistake, you're on the bench, which is what happened with Rojo. But yeah, I just didn't think.
Well, and Connor kind of lived early in the season. Connor lived on massive touchdown, efficiency. And then later in the year, was when Edmonds, was hurt. Like that was just, he got the every down roll.
Yeah.
Which is, look, if you get the every down roll as a back, like it doesn't, if you're good, that's great. But even if you're not good, you can still score fantasy points.
Yep. How about
not saying James Conner's not good, because
no, yeah,
like James Conner,
I hear you.
but I don't think he's like some elite running back.
Yep. Yeah. I think he's it'll be very interesting what happens with him this year if he goes to somewhere and as a starter. I think he'll probably be in a similar role as he was this year. Looking back at your drafts, I know you probably review your drafts. What strategies do you feel like, as far as roster builds, construction, like you were talking about hero RB, that kind of thing worked? What strategies maybe didn't work as well? And then what might you take with you for next season from any of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I haven't fully baked out, like I've done my first pass at the ranks and I've started comparing it some to ADP. So that still ultimately like helps me start to understand where pockets of value will be. And it helps determine, I start by backing into my drafts that way. Like, are there players that I really love their value that I'm willing to go overweight on that are going in rounds like 7 through 10?
Mm-hmm.
And I basically put a confidence factor by them. Like Waddles was way high just because on draft capital alone, if you just go back the last 10 years and look at, receivers that are taken in the top, 6 or 7 picks, like the hit rate, like is really great without even adding anything else, like to what they did, like, Dominator or anything like that, which is a reason a lot of people were kind of shy on Waddle. But I felt really good, about the player, felt really good about, the price tag, so that helped me know, what it was probably going to be my 5th or 6th receiver on builds where I wanted to start 4 wide receivers. So things like that, you start calculating those things in, and you basically start figuring out, okay, up top, we know there's this group for 3 rounds of players that we all probably love. There's going to be certain guys you mark off, but you're really trying to, diversify right across those. So I haven't gotten, so far into it that I can say last year's exactly going to be replicated this year. But so far from what I've seen, I feel like it's probably going to be a similar approach. But again, like what the competition does also changes what you're
right.
Right. So we don't know for sure. I'm honestly kind of surprised looking at, early ADP, which early ADP is better than it's ever been because we have, people playing so much damn best ball now. Like, it's like, you can
crazy.
you could just never stop drafting. You can just you're already drafting for next year before this season's over, before the Super Bowl. So that's the good thing is like the ADP is probably tighter, than it's ever been. But just looking at it, I'm still kind of surprised, like how many running backs are still in the first 2 rounds. I thought people would probably overreact more and push the backs further down the board. So that's
scarcity, right?
Yeah. So I'm still kind of wrestling, with that. But I think overall, like the number one thing I would say, right, is, and it works every year. It's just flexibility, right? And it can change during different times of your draft season, based on the news cycles and what's going on. Like in August, the strategy that I'm using could be different a little bit than the strategy that I'm using in July, just based on the way that the boards are more regularly falling, given news cycles, the latest influence from the influencers in the industry, that are putting out content. All those sort of things play, a factor. But I think adaptability is still like always the number one thing, and being open, never getting early in the draft. This isn't necessarily something I learned last year, but there were a few players I got a little overweight on, and you're always reminded because it just takes one injury, like Saquon kept falling into the second. I'm like, okay, former first high, obviously number 1 overall first round pick, super athletic profile. Yes. Coming off of an injury, and there was some injury news, is he going to play at the beginning of the season? I was like, I'm buying this. I'm going to buy this dip. And I still like the logic of why I wanted to get Saquon, the freak ankle twist, against Dallas really sucked. But again, I was a bit overweight, on Barkley. So even though the value is there, I got a little bit too overweight. So just knowing that I had Barkley in a tier with like 3 other guys, be more willing just to take the other guys in the tier. I got a little bit carried away with taking too much Saquon over some of the other guys that were there. Not enough like that it killed me, but I mean, I had several teams that made it in the playoffs, and like Barkley, was my only back I drafted in like until like round 7. Like I had one back and didn't
Oh,
draft
wow.
another one until round 6 or 7. And usually who I drafted in round 6 was the guy that we already
Sermon.
So yeah,
man.
I really had to work the waiver wire
Yeah.
on those teams.
That can crush you. Yeah. Yeah. What I hear you saying basically about your builds and roster construction is that you try to just be open to whatever falls, how the board falls, and be willing to, maybe you go in thinking I'm going to most likely do a hero RB build, but if it falls to you where you start with 3 or 4
Yes.
running backs, go for that. If it falls to you that you start 0 RB, go with that. Just like follow the value basically.
Yes. Like I've seen too many people, honestly, I've watched people force true 100% got to go 0 RB.
Mm-hmm.
And I've watched them pass value
Yep.
in multiple rounds. And the quickest way to sink your team is just, there are certain times you just don't want to catch a falling knife. I get it.
Yep.
But for the most part, passing on ADP is a losing proposition. Like the data has shown that. Historically, the markets are pretty good, right? And the market is the draft and the ADP. And so I think if you get so rigid and you get caught on that stuff, especially when I'm watching a 0 RB team draft their 5th and 6th receivers before grabbing a back, when a back falls to them.
I know.
In the 5th, like on that, I get it. Like, fine, there's a great value at receiver, and everybody just kept pounding you at running back. You're like, screw it, you guys, all you're going to leave me as this crappy running back. Fine,
but
take
eventually,
another receiver.
Right?
That's great. But when a value falls to you, right, in the 5th or the 6th round. Now, last year, questionable values, right, that were falling to you in those ranges. Javonte Williams, Trey Sermon, before he got hurt, Travis Etienne, like those were really the darlings. But I watched, folks even past those guys. So it's just, it's fine, to stick to your guns, but just you got to be willing to be flexible, too. If some of the best teams I build, like, were true value based, because you just never know when you're going to sit down. Like I use the poker analogy. Sometimes you just sit down at a table where no one else knows how to play.
Right.
It just happens. Or they're having a bad night. They had a bad day. They're drinking too much. They're not ready. They're distracted, whatever the case may be. Like,
and you look around with big eyes, like I'm going to take down this money right now.
And so you got to be ready, because what I'll see people do, they force something early. And then all of a sudden I'm looking down there. I'm going, man, they could have had a monster team. And they instead, like, they forced, these other things. So now again, like if you're just going to draft 3 teams and you just say, I just want to go 0 RB no matter what, look, teach his own, like, and that can still work. Like, but if I'm drafting only 3 teams, like I'm pretty much going to play it, based on value. And again, it's backwards working forwards. Some years I feel more confident about the players, the types of players that I'm wanting around 7 through 10. And that totally frees me up to do how I'm going to handle, the earlier rounds. Years where I'm not as confident about those players, I'm not as firm on the way I may handle, those early rounds. So it just depends.
Yeah. Well, if you just think just like real fast about your like top 2 or 3 teams in like the Football Guys Championship, were a mix? Was it a mix of strategies? Were they all hero RB, or how did that turn out?
They were a mix. I would say majority of my teams, I did end up drafting one running back, in the first 2 rounds, usually only one in the first 3 rounds, but there were exceptions, like double barreling running backs hard just because of the injury rates and how quickly these guys can fade. So certain years though, like one of the best fantasy years I ever had. And I mean, I was doing 0 RB stuff like 8-9 years ago, so I mean, back whenever Julio Jones and AJ Green were young, and I was getting them in like the 4th and 5th rounds or 5th and 6th rounds, of drafts. Demarius Thomas back in the day when Peyton Manning came over and you could get him in the 3rd or 4th round. I mean, I would look up, but the way the board worked and where the values were and the way I felt about backs later in the drafts that year, that equaled the strategy. But one of my best seasons ever in the season long was the year where, Kareem Hunt, ended up going, he moved up to being a 3rd round pick, by the time everything was done because Spencer Ware got hurt. But in the 2nd round, I was taking Todd Gurley. I just believed in the young talent. I believed in the offense that McVay was going to install.
That was after the year he sucked, right?
Yeah, he was terrible. Yeah. He was terrible, but he was still a young player that I wanted to bet on at
Talented.
running back.
Yep.
And so I was everywhere I could, either taking Antonio Brown or Le'Veon Bell in the first round if I was picking in the first 4 picks. And then I was turning around and I was taking those 2 players next. And I got that trio multiple times.
Yep.
And Zach Ertz was a huge hit for me that year because he had like 100 receptions. I mean, like I obliterated my leagues. Like I think I was in like that year. I may have only done like 15 teams. I want to say like in the FFPC, I won like 12 of them.
Oh my goodness.
And I want to say, and Kamara, that year my Waddle was Kamara. So I was drafting Kamara in the 10th round. So I had these teams were all 4. I was flexing 2 running backs, but it's because of the way like
it fell.
What I wanted and the way these archetypes of these players and where they were going in pockets and drafts, like I ended up building my teams where, I could flex pretty much anything, but it ended up being mostly running backs. But again, it's the way that season worked out, and every year is different. And that's one thing I think people do need to be careful with, like, are these win rates. Be careful with win rates. They're really good. Like, I love them. It's another way to think about fantasy football, to talk about it. But, every year it's like, well, if you drafted your quarterback in the 12th round, blah, blah, blah. And the best analysts don't do this, but you just see it kind of stuff floating around on Twitter. Well, yeah, when you could draft Lamar Jackson, or the year before it was Patrick Mahomes.
Exactly.
You got to have the right prospect. This last year it was really Jalen Hurts. But Trey Lance missed. Justin Fields missed. It doesn't work, every single year. So you just got to remember those sorts of things. And a lot of times when you see, win rate is if you drafted a running back in the 8th round, like that was the way to do it. Well, guess who that name was? There's a very specific name. It was James Conner. If you drafted James Conner, like you got into the playoffs, a ton this past year as an example. So again, it's about the archetype. Why did you like James Conner? Is there another James Conner this year? Not just because you want there to be one and you feel like you have to identify one, but because of all the things that go into identifying that. Do all those things line up? And do you have that type of archetype of player? And the other thing I would say is flexibility. How much flexibility do you have late? You don't want all your hopes just pinned on, well, I've got to draft these 3 players every draft, because you're going to have drafts where you can't draft them.
Right.
So you got to have a pool of players that you feel good enough about, at certain positions. And that, again, frees up the way you're just going to think about drafting.
Yeah, that's great. In those leagues, like if you think about those few leagues that you really did well this season, or whether you dominated throughout or just kind of came on strong at the end, would you say it was a great draft, waiver pickups, like just hitting on those like monsters like Debo, or like lack of injuries? What would you say would be like the main reason that you dominated those particular leagues?
I think it was mostly just the way, knowing the Waddle stuff, knowing some of the other players late that I like, being able to fill those 2 flex spots with receivers or have depth, that offset like my miss, with Sermon. So the draft was definitely the biggest part. Okay. Really, this was not a great year, in my opinion, overall for free agents.
Right. I agree.
It was okay. If you went, again, aggressiveness, Elijah Mitchell, people went all in right away.
And I thought it was crazy. I got him for 500 in a few leagues, but I thought the 1,000 was crazy,
I did too. And typically, most years, it is crazy.
I know,
because there's other things that break loose later in the year that you may need to be able to have access to. But it does show you you can really pay off to be, aggressive early. I should have, on the teams where I had Sermon.
Yeah, yep.
I should have been, which was a lot of them. I should have been even more aggressive. I was around the 40% mark, and now looking back, 40% of my fab, looking back at it, and just knowing the hype that was hitting on Twitter, like I could see the surge coming. Just how much people were talking about it. And people that play in these leagues with us, like, we're wheels up, Elijah Mitchell, all in. And so I knew it was coming.
Yeah.
Knowing that, like, I could have lived with losing more, around like 60 to 65%. That still would have left me with enough buffer, based on the way a lot of these builds were created and just the depth that I had at receiver. I probably should have done that. But I was also sitting on a lot of, running backs.
Yeah.
Well, I was also sitting on a lot of running backs that, I felt were still going to give me, a shot to fill my RB2. And some of those didn't come through. So the biggest move I made on waivers was getting Rashad Penny like way early. I probably way too early. I try to be preemptive. You have to be preemptive in these leagues that we play in, right? You can't sit back and wait for the news to dictate how you're going to build your fab. You got to constantly be finding like the next great player for $1, for
Yep.
$2.
Agree.
And that's honestly where the utilization report came from. The whole reason I created it was to try to pick up on preemptive signals
Yeah.
around players' roles that were growing, especially roles that we know are harder for coaches to give them, like for running backs, right? Playing in the receiving game. So if I'm trying to better quantify, well, how would you identify that before the receptions happen, right?
Right.
That's where I really started digging into, okay, well, when
How
do
many
coaches,
snaps?
what are the basic passing downs, for backs? I had access to all that data and then figuring out, okay, how do they score more fantasy points? What types of down and distance, 2-minute offense, all that stuff. So really, but the whole gist of that was to try to pick up on signals, before the breakout, right? And then you
Exactly.
got to go spend $600, every
Mm-hmm.
time. So I would say that's, was a big, takeaway for me this year. It was also, I probably wasn't quite aggressive enough in free agency.
Yeah. That's
Or
interesting. I mean, it's like the draft is like my favorite part. I'm sure you love it too. You love drafting. It's interesting that was
yes, I
the
draft all these teams, and
the primary driver.
but then you're just like, God, I got to do all these free agents.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's the worst. Totally. I know 2021 outside of your leagues was a big year for you with starting at PFF. And I did want to say congratulations on that. I texted you when I saw the news. I really do mean I was super happy for you. I know we met, a few years ago on Twitter. You had like, I don't know, 300 followers, and you were just grinding this utilization data for nobody, basically, except me and a couple others. And I think I had like 5 followers, and it's been awesome watching you grow and get to where you're at. So super happy for you. I just want to ask if getting the full-time job in the space has changed anything for you, like as a player, the way you approach the game, or potentially even your passion for the game, since now it's your day job. Has any of that changed?
Yeah, I mean, of course, like when you're doing something all the time, like one, I just have way more time to spend like researching all these questions and hypotheticals and things, that I want to dig into. Whereas before, I could really only do so much. I had a pretty demanding day job, working in the healthcare industry. And then, having a family, raising a
Hmm.
family, margins were like, where are you going to find the margins to truly, dig into a lot of the things you want to get into? And my wife would say I still did find that time, maybe too much sometimes. I admit it. But now I just have so much more time. So, I mean, it's huge. I can tackle so many different things. I'm my own worst enemy though, because it's like I probably need to, not try to tackle like such huge weighty topics like every time, because sometimes like I'm just like, I can get my brain like to this mode where it just doesn't want to think anymore. It's like, oh
Yeah.
my God, Dwayne, like if I have to think about, one more correlation or, R squared type, do these things matter? Like, and it's per, you can easily just continue to dig and dig and dig, right? You'll be looking at one thing, you're like, does this matter? And then you're measuring it. You're like, well, what about this? Well, crap, I got to account for competition. What if I do it this way? What if I do it this way? And so a lot of times I map all that out before I start. Like, here's kind of my idea. Here are my questions I want to answer. If this question answers this way, here's the direction I think I'm going to turn. So, I mean, that helps kind of keep me, on track, but I'm constantly having new ideas like as I'm doing the work. So
Hmm.
I could spend, 2 or 3 weeks just researching, one topic, but, I'm trying to kind of to find that balance between, quality, game changing content. Hopefully
Hmm.
not everything can be game changing. Some things I dig into and I find out like they're not going to be super predictive. Or there's just not enough data to say it's going to be predictive yet. But I always try to still learn something from everything I'm doing and then share that, with everybody else. So I would say, yeah, the passion's still there, but like what the biggest part of the passion, like for me, it's just a natural fit because I love data and I
Yeah.
love research and I love football and fantasy football. So like all that stuff, gets to come together.
Yeah. You're in
But
your
getting to
wheelhouse.
play fantasy football is still like the number one thing. And
It's
again,
still the most fun. That's awesome.
it is.
Yeah.
It's yes, it is. Now, don't be wrong. There were times writing because
Toasted.
you've seen the utilization report, like it's in
Yeah.
you write a column where you're looking at usage and stuff, and you know
Yeah.
how it can just be very time consuming. And I'm breaking down every single team, making
Yeah.
sure to get all these charts right. I'm constantly trying to find, every week I'm honestly challenging myself to find one new thing that matters if I
Right.
can, or something I can at least investigate and put that into the article. listening to feedback on Twitter of what people want and how they want the utilization report to continue to evolve over the rest of the season. And then by the time I would get to that Wednesday night, having to do all my
Waivers. Oh
waivers
gosh.
for FFPC for 26 teams, those were the times where I was like, man, next year I'm just doing best ball.
or like you start to say, I'll do 5 teams, and then by the time you get to August, it's like, forget about it.
Whatever I say, triple it. Whatever I
know,
tell you I'm
ridiculous.
going to do, triple it.
Drafting is so stinking fun. If it wasn't fun, it would be easy.
But I love having skin in the game.
I know, me too.
And I love people that put skin in the game. And I don't care if somebody spends. I like high stakes. I think is I do think that things get tougher, right, as you move up. But again, there's so many young, smart people that are just getting into it. I think it's more challenging at every level. If you're playing in national type contests, even in lower stake stuff, like just so I don't think people have to play high stakes like to have an opinion. Like I listen to anybody that's smart. I do want to know that they play the game though.
Right. Yeah, that's good. What would you say, just looking back the whole season, what's one thing like you'd say, I'm going to take this as a player forward to next season, you're going to hold on to for the future that might be helpful for our listeners, just overall strategy?
Yeah. I mean, I think, some of the things we already mentioned, right? Just not getting overweight on certain players in the same tier, especially when you're confident in your tier and it's around a certain archetype of player. So that's the Barkley example.
Yep.
And then the flip side of that, I had a similar, type tier. And I didn't Fournette should have been in the tier with Michelle and Connor. And I let other things, get in the way of that, especially knowing the offense that he was on, and especially knowing the price was not expensive, and knowing how many receivers I was already drafting before that, and knowing I could still get Waddle after that. Like, he just should have been in more of my plans. So sometimes it's also just to zoom out, right? I'm always keeping track of all my drafts, my exposures to all my players. So I knew I had 0 Leonard Fournette. I also knew the way I built my tiers, and I just had a blind spot to it for whatever reason. So I think the other thing, is if you can have, because Ian Harditz and I, so I work with Ian at PFF. Ian's awesome. Like, we would talk like throughout the year about what we had gotten right, what were the mistakes we were making, and things like that. And so just having someone like that, because he and I, we both talked about Fournette. Like, he's an immediate one we came to. And so having those conversations, if you can have like an accountability or just a thought process partner, like somebody that you can just spitball these things with, that has an open mind, right? And that can, and just, you can be on Twitter, just engaging, with others and letting other people, poke holes in your argument. I think one thing, as much as I'm into utilization, and I know we'll talk about projections, and, I love doing projections. There's so much you learn from doing them, but I don't so much get hung up on my projection is usually not my sticking point. I don't let, I've got this player projected for 5 points more than this one. Like, don't do that. You should really have these players tiered based on, factors that may have came from your projections, but it's more around grouping similar players and thinking about their upsides and their floors and things like that. And upsides more than just being young. There's lots of ways, if we always thought upside was young, then, well, what about Cooper Kupp? Cooper Kupp is not like this brand new young receiver. Like, there's different ways to get to upside. But I think thinking through those things, having someone to talk through those things with, continuing to be flexible. Pretty much everything I focus on is designed on giving you flexibility and not letting you get too tied, especially in your early rounds, just to a certain few players.
Yeah, that's really great. That advice you gave about the first 3 rounds staying diversified, I think, is super important. And it's something I asked some of the other experts about, like, how focused are you on avoiding having an overabundance of certain players, in your portfolio. And somebody else, can't remember which one it was, but said the same thing you did. Once we get past, I think it was Theo, once we get past like round 8, I don't worry about it. It's all good. Take the guy you want. But I really like that.
And that cutoff can be different every year, right?
Yeah,
like, where you all of a sudden don't care about it,
Yeah.
Last year, I wish I would have cared about it more in the 6th round with Trey Sermon, but I was happy I didn't care about it in the 9th round with Jalen Waddle.
Yeah, it's a definitely.
And Elijah Moore would have been another one. Like, he was my 10th round guy. Like, he was on a ton of my teams. Like, he was about, like, he popped right in the middle of the season, just the early season injury, those sort of things that happen to young receivers. We know that can hurt their early part of their season. But so yeah, I think the cutoff can be different, each year. Now, I will say there are certain players that I do avoid sometimes in early rounds, like knowing players that I just don't want to have on my team. And I think
you have them below, right? You have them below ADP.
Yes,
and you just
and
don't
so
want them
typically, so every once in a while they may fall far enough that I'll go ahead and take them. But there are certain players like I will say, like I just don't, like I'm still not going to take them no matter what. It's like they're almost off my board.
Right.
That's really pretty rare. It's really pretty rare.
Yep. Very cool. If our listeners, I know we have a lot of listeners who are, very seasoned players, but there's some that are pretty fresh. And, if they want to maybe improve, is something I've asked every expert we've had on. Maybe they want to jump into high dollar contests or, just compete against stronger players. What's one thing you would say, like, if you want to really take a next step in your game that you should work on, what's one thing that maybe could set them apart from the crowd a little bit?
So I'm just a big believer in, gaming everything out like ahead of time. You don't just everything you're doing in your preparation and the way you're getting your mind ready is to be able to be like nimble. And again, you've heard me talk about multiple concepts, like building from the back to the front. How confident are you about certain players later? Why are you confident about those players? Are they for reasons that actually over time have shown like that, you're placing, good bets and you're just getting them cheap, or are you just placing them because you are going to draft 0 running back and you have to have running backs to fill those spots? Like those are two different thought processes, right? In the way that you're thinking about, building a winning roster. So I would say everything you're doing should be about thinking multiple steps ahead. Like think about it like chess, not really, like checkers. So as you're in your draft, constantly paying attention, and things are so much easier nowadays, Kevin, than what it used to be. I remember when it was an advantage that I would have a handmade board where I'm writing everybody's picks and I know what everybody has and they don't. Well, now everybody takes that it's for granted, right? Like, yeah, we see the draft board. I know how many running backs the player behind, but I still see people make mistakes. They're drafting at the turn. They draft a running back when the player behind them already has 3 running backs and they need a receiver and they let the receiver go. Like, so being present, staying, attentive. I'm not a great multitasker. Some people, may be better at it than me. I argue that multitasking, like, to some extent, it's a myth. Like some people are good at being able to handle multiple things and not let it stress them out, but your attention can only go, to one thing. Some people are better about getting their attention back on something quicker, things like that. But, you can only think about so many things at one time. So just putting yourself in a space like to be ready. Like typically when I'm working with someone and helping them, it's these little mistakes I see them making, especially now with so many people just drafting on their phone, lay in bed, watching TV, just drafting on my phone. Like, like I don't do that.
I got everything out.
I've done it, but I don't do it, very often. I'll do it some for best ball, just because I'm trying to like get like to the amount of teams I want to have in there. But I prefer really to be like in an atmosphere where everything's just ready to go. And I think that's high stakes taught me a lot of that because I just really valued the money I was putting into it. Yeah. I was like, I really, I need to really be like on point and be ready. So everything is about thinking multiple steps ahead. Nothing in the draft really surprises you. The freak out moment, like just tanks people. Like when all of a sudden they pin their hopes on these 3 things happening, they don't happen, or you get too stuck on your takes. Like those are just things that put your brain, it stresses it out in a time when you need to be able to be, nimble, thinking on your feet, open. And the more prepared you are and the more steps you're thinking ahead, I'm always thinking 2 and 3 picks ahead, like the whole time the draft's going. Like I know my board, I know it like the back of my hand at this point, but I'm watching what other people are doing. And some of it, you just get from drafting so much. It's like you can just get a feel for it, but you have to be paying attention to get good, at being able to do things like that. So I was just saying being present, is huge. Thinking multiple steps ahead. The way you build your tiers should be based on that flexibility, should be based on all these things.
Yeah, that's really good advice too. With a lot, if they're newer players and they haven't really dived into tiers yet, and just seeing your tiers as equal, players in a sense. If they're in the same tier.
You'll know, like if you're not comfortable with a certain tier or a player in a tier, like then you go back and you look at it and you're like, okay, why do I never want to draft this player?
Exactly. Yep.
and sometimes your intuition's right. You're like, you know what, they do belong down here. But if it's like last year, maybe what if I'd originally had Leonard Fournette in the right tier and I was just never drafting him? You don't want to just move him down.
Right.
If he's in the tier
Right.
for a reason, like you got to walk through that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I wish I had Debo in a higher tier. I'll tell you that. Killed me, man. Very cool. Thank you for answering those questions. We're going to move on to our closing exercise here, so we can get you out of here in not too long. What we wanted to do is just kind of walk through. I started with the earliest, moving toward the latest, and Dwayne and I are both working off of what's it called, the never too early best ball at FFPC. The current ADP. So we're going through that, and we'll just do one at a time. I'll let you start. Who's the first player you have that you think is a value or someone you'd be targeting at ADP?
Antonio Gibson's one for me. So last year I was out on Antonio Gibson because of a very specific type of back that was with him, JD McKissic, being so good in the passing game, even though we knew how good Antonio Gibson could be in the passing game. But this year, we'll have to wait and see. But as of right now, like, I'm assuming McKissic's going to be gone. And so if McKissic is gone, then people will be fading Gibson for the wrong reasons. Like, still a young back, athletic profiles of somebody that can catch passes out of the backfield. We're talking about a PPR format, like could easily be in the top 5 backs, but people will let recency bias, him playing through an injury, him playing with JD McKissic, they'll just say, nope, not doing it again. And that's why he's going in the 3rd round now. Like, if JD McKissic is gone, Antonio Gibson should be a late 1st round pick, if not an early 2nd round pick. Like, he could be what everybody hoped he would be last year. Remember, he played through an injury. He had a stress fracture in his shin. We have seen the explosive playmaking ability out of him in the past. But the biggest thing, young back, meets a lot of the metrics, could be very involved in the passing game. If you give McKissic's passing role to Gibson, even this past year, go look at the games where Gibson got to handle the passing work. He was already a top 12 back. He was a top 6 back in those games for the most part. So that's a huge one, Antonio Gibson.
Yeah, very hard to trust the coaching staff there to give him a 3-down role, but man, I hope they do. He was at 3.1 on our ADP for reference for folks. My first one was actually not till the 6th round. Michael Carter was one I wanted to mention. He's at 6.6. For me, Carter showed he's a legit NFL back last season, rushed over 600 yards, 300 yards through the air on a very poor offense. I know their line was decent. I think their line actually could improve still this coming season. Mekhi Becton was out for most of the year, their number 1 pick. I think they'll probably go line again in the first round here. So I don't know. A lot of it probably is up to Zach Wilson improving, which I'm not sure I'm confident about. But I think if the Jets are even close to a 500 team, Carter could be a league winner.
Yeah, I like Carter too. His whole thing just really depends on the draft. Did they take another back in the 2nd or 3rd round this year? If they don't, I'm with you. I think you're going to see this team in the offseason beef up the offensive line. I think you'll also see them add tight ends. They want to run more 21-12 personnel. They want to run these heavier sets, more like the Kyle Shanahan style of offense. So yeah, if Michael Carter doesn't get competition, I love it. Like, so a lot of these do have this. Like, Antonio Gibson's definitely on McKissic being gone. Like, McKissic is gone, he'll be the passing down back. Like, and so you're locked, you're ready to rock. The reason I avoided him last year was McKissic. So with a guy like Carter, it's a similar kind of thing. It just depends what they do in the draft. The only thing I don't like about Carter is low draft capital, right? Really easy to draft another player. But where we are right now, I'm totally with you. He's one of the names that I actually had written down. So I'll stick with running back one more. So we're talking about dead zone running backs here, Kevin. So I think this is actually an example, right? There's a difference, like, in the type of backs that you may want. You don't get hung up on nomenclature. Oh, dead zone running back means I can't draft a running back in these rounds. Well, what receivers are available, in these rounds? What types of backs are available in these rounds? And obviously there's more, data points to come with the draft free agency, but Travis Etienne is another one. Like, high draft capital. We know he's still going to get a chance. Should be fully recovered from his injury. And he's shown a proclivity to do really well in the passing game. He hits on all the things I really want. And what's funny is I don't necessarily love Travis Etienne's film.
I don't either.
I don't think it's great. But at the same time, like, I've just watched too many backs with this profile. Like DeAndre Swift is another one. you
Yep.
know. So those are players that I just want to have access to. Like, Travis Etienne could catch, 80 balls. Like it's within the realm of possibility, and he's
Yep.
still a young back, right?
Well, we
James
got
Robinson
James
had
Robinson hurt. Yeah.
late season injury, and I
Yep.
like James Robinson.
Yep.
And he may actually be the better in between the tackles runner, but I've just seen these things play out too many times where ETN is a back that will be going in those middle rounds that I will definitely have exposure to.
I like it. Yeah. And he's at mid fifth round right now. So that is dead zone, but I don't care. I think it's a good choice. My next one was Kadarius Toney. I have him. He's at 8.12 in this ADP. I just generally don't ignore flashes when I see him with rookies. I think he flashed, even though he didn't play that many games, and he was hurt a lot. He was dynamic, man. He only had 420 yards receiving, and he did not score, which was, looking back, that was a bit surprising. But I think that's going to keep his ADP down. I think if Dayball comes in there and can kind of even turn the offense around a little bit, help Daniel Jones even a little bit, Toney could be a breakout. So I think he's worth the gamble in the 8th.
Yeah, I like Toney. I think he's an interesting one. I agree with what you said. Like the flash, like definitely caught my attention because
Mm-hmm.
the first flash came against the Cowboys. And so, I mean, I watch every snap of every Cowboy game. So it was just, I just saw it. I watched him like get open, against, Trayvon Diggs. Didn't matter really who he lined up against,
Right.
and I'm not just talking open, I'm talking like wide open.
Yeah.
So I really did like that because really his college profile was didn't really
Mm-hmm.
break out till later. The first round draft capital, though, obviously is big. But the big thing I love about what you're with Toney is the flash, and like you mentioned, the draft. He's an 8th round pick,
Mm-hmm.
so that's the kind of guy that you're looking for. So I do like that one.
Yeah.
So I'll do another one like this, going a little earlier than that. But I probably should have picked some even later ones, just like based on like how I talked about like these rounds 8 through 10. But there is one more in the 6th round, and so I don't overweight coaching and scheme. It goes into everything I do. It goes in the way that I work projections, but there are certain coaches and certain schemes that I really pay even more attention to. And so just really Josh McDaniel landing in Las Vegas, like for me, Hunter Renfrow,
Yeah.
was
Thought about
already,
him.
a top 12 PPR receiver.
Yep.
I was too late to get on board. But the reason why is it really early in the season, and we had seen this before, and Renfro's always been fine when he's on the field. But it's been the Raiders like to run all this heavy personnel
The
package
snap
stuff.
counts were too low. Yeah.
Routes per drop back would be in the 60s. You can't,
Yep.
it's just tough to have any kind of consistency. So I think now with Josh McDaniel coming over, and knowing the way that Derek Carr likes to play and the rapport he has with Renfro,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing, for example, McDaniel is a guy that kept Wes Welker on the field for 90% of routes.
Mm-hmm.
He had done that with Danny Amendola in the past. He's done that with Julian Edelman. So similar archetype players, he's found ways to keep them on the field, even when running 12 and 21 personnel, by putting them in the Z, still keeping them off the line, using motion, doing different things. So I think this year you're going to see Hunter Renfro play. He'll be out there for 90%.
Yeah. I like it.
So
and I think he's still
yeah.
What's that?
No, I was just saying that's the big thing, for me. He's probably underdrafted just based on what he already did last year, and now you add that in. And Renfro's a player that I really like.
Yeah, I think he's still underestimated. I mean, it sort of reminds me of Cooper Kupp. He's a ridiculous route runner. I don't think he's got Kupp's overall game, but yeah, I think he could jump up to be like a 3rd or 4th round pick by next season if, like you're saying, he's playing 90% of snaps. So that's a great call. My next guy was Ramondre Stevenson. He was at 9.10 in this ADP. I mean, hey, he could be behind Damian Harris all season again, but when I watch those two backs, I feel like he is way more dynamic. Finished with 4.6 yards a carry, got 5 touchdowns on the ground. And he also showed he can catch the ball, which, coming in, there was a lot of talk that he couldn't do that. So theoretically, he could play on all 3 downs. I mean, if he were to overtake Damian Harris, I know it's unlikely, but he could be a league winner if so. So again, another one of those later round backs that I'm going to probably be overweight on.
Yeah. There's several of those right now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the rookies fit into that as well, and that we have to see where they're going to land. But like Isaiah Spiller, Kenneth Walker, like Brees Hall's a bit high, for me right now. So landing spot's going to matter for all of these guys. So I don't want to say Brees Hall is too high. His landing spot matters as well.
Right.
But I think I think all of these guys right now, if you're drafting in best ball, like I want exposure to them, especially at their prices, because once they do find their landing spot, like they're going to move a lot. Like certain guys are going to move up, certain guys are going to move down, because with running back, like talent matters, but just the path to the touches is really huge. So yeah, the other player I would say, outside of the rookie, running backs, I would go with Chase Claypool. So you had mentioned Kadarius Toney. So like Claypool, we're gonna have to see what happens with the quarterback situation first.
Right.
Like if it's Mason Rudolph, gonna be worried. So, but right now, like you're getting him in the 9th round,
right.
And so you're getting a guy that's yes, did he struggle some, in his second season? Yes, but a lot of what people are glomming onto, is really, what he did, on a Thursday night football game as a young player, getting up and doing the first down signal and maybe costing his team the game. But
it's funny though.
Steelers had made a lot of mistakes before that, but people are grabbing onto that. This is still a young player with a dynamic playmaking profile. We need to see what happens with the quarterback. But round 9 is pretty ridiculous for a third-year player that's done the things Claypool has done.
Yeah, and right after him in this draft, I have Bateman on my list. Also a guy who flashed. I mean, he didn't flash that much, but when he was on the field, he got a ton of targets. He didn't get to play with Lamar that much, but I just think he's, from what I've seen, and I'm not a Matt Waldman type of guy with tape expertise, but from what I can see on the field, I think he's more talented than Marquise Brown. So I really like him in the 10th.
Yeah, I think Brown's really good, but I do like Bateman. Bateman's college profile was really great. So that's going to be an interesting offense. If all of a sudden they go back to running the ball more, which they probably will, because they'll get J.K. Dobbins, they'll get Gus Edwards back. They started last year, they struggled throwing the ball so much. They threw the ball 10% or almost 11% more. They dropped back to pass 11% more than they did the year before. I'd see some kind of middle ground, but I think they're going to want to win through efficiency. So these players are still going to have a chance to get there. But I don't know that we'll see the same amount of targets for all of them. So I do think Marquise Brown does things in that offense that, Bateman can't do just because of his speed and ability to win down the field. But Bateman also is really good, in his own right. I know, like, his college profile, I really liked coming out. So I like that one too.
Yeah. You have anybody else on your list, or we take them all?
I didn't have anything written down, but I'm just looking real quick, like see if there was anything, that I missed. No, I think we hit on most of them. My eyes keep going to the green and the running backs. I'm trying to make it go on the yellow and the receivers. I mean, Rondell Moore, is another one, but we just need to see role expansion. We need to see not just everything at the line of scrimmage,
which could happen if Kirk leaves, and it's possible.
Yeah. So Kirk, if Kirk lands in Buffalo or wherever else, I mean, so obviously a lot to still go on, with free agency. But like the receivers, like I like Chris Olave, he's going in the 12th round right now.
Rookies,
we'll see where Russell Gage lands, but like he popped in some metrics that I really care about last season. So we'll see what happens. If he lands in a pass-heavy offense as the number 2 or 3 option, like Gage is a guy that I could see myself really having, wanting some access to. I like Jamison Williams too, but he's coming off the ACL. But I do think, wow, what an explosive playmaker, and with how quickly players recover from these injuries nowadays. Let's see where
he's being mocked to the Chiefs, so that'd be nice.
Man, if he lands there, well, number one, he'll shoot up like 5 rounds.
Right, I know. Then you can't afford him.
People won't care about the knee anymore.
Right.
But you would just have to be in on, man. He would be. That would give 2 huge vertical threats to Mahomes.
Nice.
Now Mahomes would truly have 3 good weapons at all times in the route. Right now he really has 2, because, you live there. Nicole Hardman and Demarcus Robinson, they're just not. They're not it.
They're not it.
So, but man, if he landed with the Chiefs, I even like David Bell going in the 16th round. His profile's not great coming out of college. It's solid. He had a good breakout. He had a young breakout. So, I mean, there's some positive things. So, I think sitting here and like looking at this, like just based on everything we talked about, like if I was to have to say what's an early draft strategy formulation, probably going receivers maybe the first 4 rounds, a true zero, just because of all the names we like that fit the type of archetypes that I like at backs. Like you could easily, walk away with 4 good receivers or maybe 3 receivers and a tight end in your first 4 picks. And then honestly not feel completely pinned in about backs. You could still nail 4 or 5 of them while working in a couple more receivers. We'd have to figure out how to handle quarterback. I haven't thought too much about quarterback this year.
Justin Fields, that's my target this year.
Yeah, Justin Fields is everybody's, so far. Fields and Lance are the 2.
Yeah. That was actually my other one.
To the rushing attempts.
My other one was actually Cole Kmet. I really liked what I saw with him.
Yeah,
he had 93 targets, last season, which I did not realize. I looked at the numbers and just scored 0 touchdowns, which that is hard to do. 93 with 0 touchdowns. So I really think he could make a big jump.
I could have used that. He was my second most drafted tight end last year. In FFPC, you're not cutting him. Trevor Lawrence could be another one. Could be interesting. We saw for a little stretch last year where they got him more involved in the RPO game, got him a little bit going and designed rushing attempts. That's certainly in his wheelhouse. So we'll have to see, what does Doug Peterson do, with the offense there. But I'm not ready just to completely think that, Trevor Lawrence is a flop.
No,
I think he could give you what you're looking for, just a young quarterback period, in the right situation, could give you that 300 to 400 yards rushing, right?
You're right. Yep.
Doesn't even have to be great, but it's just enough. Like when Dak was younger, he used to give you that. We saw that back in the day, with Aaron Rodgers, he had a lot more of that. He's athletic enough to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. One last question for you before we wrap up. What do you think of Ronald Jones in the 14th?
I think it just depends on where does Rojo go. And Rojo, the problem, it's just the self-implosion stuff.
I know.
He's
got such good talent between the tackles, I feel like.
He does, but the problem is he's not really good in pass protection.
I know.
He has terrible hands. So he immediately limits himself. And then if he makes any kind of mistake in that 2-down roll, right, you're in trouble. But I do think in the 14th round, this is the year that I may actually draft Rojo. I do think it matters where he lands.
Yep.
But man, if Ronald Jones signed in San Francisco, or signed, half the league is running the damn Shanahan offense now.
Mm-hmm.
So if he landed in any of those schemes, and you saw, an okay offensive line, I could see Rojo being someone that I stash several times.
I like Atlanta.
You mentioned it,
Cordero Patterson, let him take his spot.
Yeah, maybe. Patterson, man, if I'm Atlanta,
I'd sign him. Yeah.
I would sign Patterson.
No,
he's not going to get that much money, just because of his age.
Yeah.
But the guy doesn't have, that many touches on him.
Right. It's true.
Just because no coach is really, he's like the Rubik's Cube. No coach could ever figure him out, until, Arthur Smith did.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, that was awesome to hear your thoughts, man. I appreciate that. It's been very interesting and fun to have you on. Before we sign off, just want to ask a couple favors of our listeners. Please tweet or share about this podcast if you enjoyed it. I think it'd be helpful to a bunch of people hearing Dwain's thoughts. So please share that. Please subscribe if you haven't done that. Rate and review the podcast if you haven't done that. I'd appreciate that. And you can consider supporting the podcast over at Anchor. Even $1 a month can make a difference. Thanks so much, Dwain, for being here. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.